Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Good. My guest for this episode is once again Dr. Debbye Turner Bell, a celebrated leadership authority, network news journalist, former Miss America, and best-selling author of the book, Courageous Faith, a lifelong pursuit of faith over fear. In this second part of my conversation with Debbye, we continue to discuss her extraordinary life, picking up right after she won the Miss America title. This next chapter introduces even greater challenges for her, testing her faith and pushing her to discover deeper levels of courage and perseverance. And join us as we explore how she navigated these trials and the powerful lessons she learned along the way. Enjoy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. Welcome to the program again, Debbye.
Thank you so much, Charles. It's my pleasure to be here.
For you, Miss America, it was also a beginning of another journey that would prove even harder for you than what you just came through. Because Miss America didn't make you excellent. You were something before that evening that you were even crowned. I mean, this is just who you were, and you're going to be humble before God, and you wanted to display authenticity throughout your time during that whirlwind year where you traveled to so many countries, had so many speaking engagements. And describe to me how difficult it was to remain authentic to yourself and really prioritize your faith.
Yes, well, Gussie Turner played a big role in that. She was determined for me to stay true to my faith and to remember what got me there and who got me there. So she reminded me on a daily basis. And she was always asking, are you praying? Are you reading your Bible? During my years, Miss America, particularly in those days, there was a lot of travel. I traveled 20,000 air miles a month. I was in and out of a city every 18 to 36 hours. I worked 7 days a week, 48 weeks out of that year. It was, I liken it to a presidential campaign. I mean, it was an intense year. But my mother did not want me to lose my faith or lose myself because it's a heady experience and it's easy to sort of get caught up in the hype. And so she played a key role in keeping me grounded, and she would make sure that I was going to church, whatever city I happened to be in. Are you going to church this Sunday? Have you found a church that you can go to? So she was constantly in my ear about that. And I was determined. It was not just my mom nagging me. That was important to me. And so I even had a little system with my local church that I was a part of at the time. And this was way back in the day before the internet and before even email. And my church would record the sermons, record the services on cassette tapes. That's how long ago this was. And what makes me sad is there's some people who might watch or hear this podcast and not even know what a cassette tape is. But be that as it may, they would ship 4 at a time to wherever I was so that I could hear the sermons that were being preached at my local church to make sure I stayed connected to my faith. So I had to be intentional about that. And it was so important. And to your point, Charles, what I love to say was, I wasn't Debbye Turner because I won Miss America. I won Miss America because I was Debbye Turner. And so I was determined not to change, not one bit of that, and just simply be who God created me to be. Because what I knew for sure then, and I still know it today, is nobody can out Debbye Turner me. I'm the only one, and I can do it better than anybody. So why would I try to be like anyone else? And that's a message that I've tried to share, particularly with young people everywhere I go, is nobody can be who you are. You're singularly unique. And that gives you an edge in a way that no one else can have if we are true and be authentic to who we really are.
I love that, because for that whole year, you had stated that you couldn't afford looking slouchy. You couldn't wear sweatpants. You were always in makeup. You couldn't be grouchy. Perfection was the expectation. Loneliness set in, and it was really a difficult year for you to manage. So by the time your reign was up, you were in some ways looking forward to it and looking forward to being not Miss America, but now Dr. America.
Yes. Yeah. It was a tough year. Just the sheer amount of travel. And many people don't realize this because I've lived an extroverted, out loud life, but I am a raging introvert. I recharge in solitude. And I had to push through that to be Miss America that whole year and to do everything that I still do to this day with even consulting and leadership development. And I'm a ordained pastor and ministering. All of that causes me to push through my natural tendencies in order to serve in the ways that I've been called. So for all the introverts out there, they'll understand this. People and a lot of attention wear us out. And during that year as Miss America, I had very few opportunities to recharge. And so by the end of the year, I was depleted. I was depleted physically, I was depleted spiritually, I was depleted emotionally. And I promptly went into a depression after that year. It is a lonely year. It's the probably one of the loneliest years of my life because I was in and out of a city. I traveled with a traveling companion, but not with someone they became very dear friends to me by the end of the year, but at the beginning, they were strangers to me. And so I didn't have my village, I didn't have my friends, I didn't have my family. And at that time, everyone's clamoring to get to me because I'm Miss America, not because I'm Debbie. And there's an immense loneliness that comes with that. Many celebrities today will talk about that. You don't know if someone wants to be in your presence because they want something from you or because they're really interested in you. And that takes a mental and a psychological toll that's hard to describe. And so by the end of the year, I was just depleted. That's the best word I have for it. And so I did go into this sort of state of depression. I went through this time. I didn't want to go anywhere. I was still speaking and traveling at that time. And there were times that I would even cancel an event because I just didn't have it in me. I just didn't have enough reserves in me to keep going at that pace. And so I got some counseling and I learned how to take care of myself. Self-care wasn't a thing back then, but once I finally learned why I was so tired and so fatigued because I was not leaving space to get refilled, and then began to build in a system to care for myself and to refill before going out and pouring out again. That was a life changer. It was a game changer for me. And to this day, 30 some odd years later, I still build into my schedule that time to recharge spiritually as well as physically and emotionally to be able to go so hard and so long and be effective at it. But it started with that deep depression right after Miss America.
Well, it seems like for the next 5 years, you finish the reigning Miss America, you finish that part of your life, you finish veterinary school, you want to become a veterinarian, but Ralston Purina was just too good of an opportunity to pass up. The Caring for Pets campaign, now you're speaking maybe on an equally crazy schedule, and you were just physically exhausted, like you said, emotionally depleted. You didn't want to be around people. And then at one of the lowest points in your life, then some health issues came up with your mother and you knew that your mother was on the decline.
And I didn't see it coming. Again, my mother was bigger than life. She was Wonder Woman, Superman, Batman, all wrapped into one in my eyes. Thought she was invincible. I thought she would live 100 years. And she was diagnosed with cancer. She went through treatments. It was intense because they caught it late because she cared for everybody else but herself. But I had faith. I grew up in a praying household and I'd seen God do miraculous things in my life, in other people's lives. And so I had every belief that my mom was going to recover, that God was going to heal her, whether it was through the radiation or just do it miraculously by his power. Never expected that she would die. And she finished her round of radiation, the treatment that they had prescribed for her, and was declared cancer free. They thought they'd gotten it all. And we now know it probably was coming back, but the side effects, not to be too graphic and to share too much information, did as much damage to her normal tissue as it did to the cancerous tissue. And she developed a catastrophic bleed and passed away unexpectedly. And it was earth shattering. It was cataclysmic because I just didn't see it coming. I was convinced God was going to heal her. And my mother was my rock. She was my best friend. I never made any important decision without her up to that point. And I didn't know. I was 29. I was fully grown, out of the house, a homeowner, traveling the world, but she was still my mommy. And I didn't know who Debbie was without Gussie. And so I had to grow up in a way that I didn't know I needed to. Grow up spiritually, grow up emotionally when she passed away, because the earth moved under me when that happened.
Well, it also one of the things that I kind of noticed, and I wanted to see if I was accurate in that during that time up to that point, your mother was the spiritual rock of your family, and possibly that caused you to be maybe a little bit more distant from God because you kind of used your mom as the intercessor to say, "Pray for me on this, pray for me on that." Now your mom's up in heaven, and you know that now there's no intercessor, now there's no person in between. You need to deepen your faith and talk directly to Him.
Yeah, you're exactly right. You hit the nail on the head. My mother, I didn't know it at the time, but she was a spiritual crutch, because I knew if I wasn't praying, she was. And if I didn't know what to do, I knew I could go to her and ask her, what did God say? What should I do? And she would always say, "You've got to pray. You've got to hear from God too." But I knew ultimately she was praying. And I knew that she was studying the Bible. So I could go to her and say, "What does the Bible say about this? What does the Bible say about that?" And I didn't realize how dependent upon her I was, not just for, the social and emotional things that a daughter might depend on a mother for, but for spiritual things. I mean, she really was my spiritual covering. And so when she died so unexpectedly, I got that crutch was literally knocked out from under me. And I had to learn how to stand on my own 2 feet, spiritually, emotionally, professionally, all those things. And probably many of the things that I'm able to do and privileged to do now as a minister and even as a consultant came as a result of having to grow up and learn to stand on my own 2 feet because of her death. Now, I would give my right arm for her to still be on earth and to be able to see my daughter grow up. But I also see how God turned something that was cataclysmic and terrible and used it for my good, because I grew up in ways that prepared me for the life that I've lived since.
Wonderful. That's a great lesson and a great way to get closer to God, even though it's on an unfortunate circumstance. But God makes everything turn out for the best when you trust in Him.
Yeah, and can I jump in and just say this, Charles? What reminds me, and I did tell this story in the book, when I was 7 years old, growing up in this Christian household, church going, Bible believing, praying household, my mother sat me down and said, "You will not get to heaven on my apron string. You will have to know God for yourself. You'll have to read the Bible on your own. You'll have to learn how to hear the voice of God." And she led me through what we call in the church a prayer of salvation. She asked me, did I want Jesus to be my personal Lord and Savior? And at 7, she led me to Christ, sitting at our kitchen table. And little did I know how true those words would be, 22 years later when she left this earth. I did have to know God for myself. I did have to pray on my own. And she planted those seeds when I was 7 years old. And I'm grateful for that.
Let's move now to the Caring for Pets program. You've been doing that for about 5 years, and in one of your television interviews, you were noticed by an agent, Babette Perry, that said she believed you could have a successful career on television. So, describe that transition into your TV career and how that went from St. Louis to CBS in New York.
Yes. So even after my years Miss America, and I started working for the Caring for Pets program with Ralston Purina, I had every intention to do that for a few years, just sort of capitalize on the fame and name recognition that I had at the time, and then I planned on going back into practice. I actually wanted to be board certified in internal medicine, in small animal medicine, and teach at a veterinary school. And so I fully intended to do that. And as a result of traveling the country and talking about, excuse me, animal welfare and pet care for Ralston Purina, I did a lot of television news interviews. And so, as you mentioned, Babette Perry saw me do one of those interviews, cold called me and said, "Hey, I think you could have a career in television. I'm an agent. Would you like me to book something for you?" I didn't know her. I didn't know what she wanted. And this was definitely back in those days where a lot of people approached me, and some had nefarious motivations and ulterior motives. And so, I was like, "Oh, no, no, thank you. I'm going to be a veterinarian." And she was persistent. And over a year, she kept calling and saying, "Hey, this is available. Do you think you'd like to do it? And finally, just to get rid of her, I said, okay, book something. Because I didn't really even believe she was who she said she was. And she did. She booked a gig to host a national program for Modern Bride. It was a wedding special. And I realized, oh, she really is an agent. She's real. And at that time, after that, she goes, well, what would you like to do? And I was already doing, a little bit of television around animals, giving pet advice. And so my first job in television was doing pet segments for the local news in St. Louis. And one thing just led to another. That led to being a reporter on a national pet show on PBS called The Gentle Doctor. I eventually moved into the host of that show. And then that moved into hosting an entertainment show in St. Louis that had nothing to do with animals. And I did that for 5.5 years. And coming toward the end of my contract with that job, by this time, I'm 5 years or more out of veterinary school. And I'm at this critical inflection point where either I needed to go back into my chosen profession and begin to practice or pursue this TV thing. And I was feeling reams of guilt because I'd spent my whole childhood dreaming about being a veterinarian, spent all this money becoming a veterinarian. Thank God I won the Miss America pageant, was able to pay back all those loans, and I wasn't practicing, and I really felt guilty about that. And I talked to a mentor of mine who was a corporate executive at Ralston and also a veterinarian, and I just kind of laid out my guilt and how do I make this decision? I need to decide. I was at a fork in the road. And he said something that gave me the permission that I needed. Didn't know I needed it. He said, Debbie, you can do more good for animals talking to 1 million pet owners at a time than you can spaying one dog at a time. And that was the release I needed. And so I decided, okay, I'm gonna pursue this TV thing and take it as far as it'll take me. And I thought, I'd get maybe a good 5 years out of it, and then I'd go back to veterinary medicine. And I ended up going to a journalism convention, met one of the executives for the early show, which was the morning show at CBS at that time. Nothing came of that conversation in that moment, but a few weeks later, a position opened up. She remembered me, reached out to my agent, Babette, and said, hey, we'd like to see if Debbie would be interested in this position. They flew me out. I interviewed for that position, got the job, and that was the beginning of my career at the network level at CBS News, and eventually moved to New York, spent 11 years at CBS News. But that all started doing pet segments in St. Louis, Missouri.
And that concluded, like you said, around 2011, because CBS decided to scrap the early show from the ground up. You knew your career in journalism was over. It was time to reset again. And that's when you gave your good friend, Dr. Jean Porter King, a call and said, what do I do next?
Yeah. And at that point, even when I was on the air as a broadcast journalist with CBS, I was still doing speaking, motivational speaking, as much as my job would allow. And it started doing some workshop facilitation. And so when CBS got rid of all their correspondents, of which I was one, I actually went on to another, TV job. I was an anchor for a startup global cable news network called Arise. I did that for almost 3 years. And that wasn't the right fit. It was bad for me in many ways. And so I walked away from that with no job to walk to. And living in New York, and that's a very expensive place to live without something like a TV income. And so I was looking for some opportunities to make money, to make up the income that I'd lost by walking away from television. And called my very dear sister friend, Dr. Jean Porter King. She was just Jean Porter back then. And she was a successful consultant and trainer. And I said, hey, if you ever need a trainer, a facilitator, I'm available. I'd love to learn more about this. And she said, sure. She had a big client and she needed some associate facilitators. And so she took me on there. Turned out I had an affinity for it. I was pretty good at it. And, it was at her suggestion. She says, why don't you develop your own content? Because I was telling her about ways she could bulk up her communication segment in her content. And I was like, you could do this and you could do that. And she goes, Debbie, that's your area. Why don't you develop that? And I was like, okay. And she goes, and I'll introduce you to someone. And at the time, she introduced me to a gentleman named Daniel, who was your predecessor at Institute for Management Studies at IMS. And that was the beginning of me doing consulting on my own, and then eventually starting my own business, my little boutique business in communications and women's leadership.
And during that time too, that transition between you're done with the network, you're moving in a new direction, your faith was tested as well. And I love how you state in the book, that waiting on God should not be passive. We are not sitting down idly, waiting on some heavenly package to drop on our doorstep. Usually, when we are eager for something, we prepare for it. So we need to believe in God's ability. We actively prepare for his performance. And your question that you state to the reader is, are you believing God to provide the resources for you in your areas? Because that's what it took for you, because fear sets in when you don't have faith.
Absolutely. And that's the subtitle of my book. It's a lifelong pursuit of faith over fear. Faith will propel us forward. It will cause us to get the degree when we don't think we have the capacity for it. It will cause us to pick up the phone and ask for coffees and meetings with mentors and those that we admire to get information even when we don't have an opportunity in front of us. But when we live a life of faith, even though sometimes we have to wait for the fruition of what we want, there's always activity. I heard a quote by Michael Jordan, of all people, and he says, if you're not prepared when opportunity knocks, you might as well not be at home. Those are my words at the end of the, but you've got to be prepared when that opportunity comes. And that's where active waiting comes in. Get the degree. Even if you don't have a book deal, begin to write the book proposal, write the book, put together files, ask people, pick people's brains. Throughout my entire adult career, whenever I've met someone that is either doing really well, something that I admire, or doing something that I want to do, I do everything I can to pick their brain. Hey, can I buy you a cup of coffee? Can I buy you lunch? Tell me your story. How did you get there? How did you get over this hump or past that challenge? So that when that opportunity comes, we're fully prepared for it. If we've been sitting on the couch and opportunity knocks, I think we won't even hear the sound at the door.
I'm with you on that. It's a lot of truth in that statement. And it took you, what, 7 years to win the Miss America. It took you 15 years to realize that the man of your dreams was already in your life with Gerald. And he was your booking agent for so many years. And the timing was never right. But eventually things changed. God changed you. And thankfully for both of you, you are now together, happily married. You have an amazing daughter and a wonderful life.
Yes, thank you for pointing out that I'm a slow learner, which is fine. Better late than never. But yeah, I give a lot of detail in the book, and I will invite the listeners to get the book, Courageous Faith, and read all the details. But yes, I met who would become my husband in 1991, I believe. And I don't even remember our first meeting. He remembers every detail, but he was an event planner at the time. He booked me to speak at a youth conference. And then I came back to that same area, which was Columbus, Ohio, a few times, and he facilitated those speaking engagements. I remember, I think the third time I went back, that's when I remember him. He was just a really nice guy. We decided we would stay in touch, but there was no attraction, no love connection, at least not on my part. But it was just cool people. And so we would talk once or twice a year, prayed together, processed whatever challenges we were facing. He was caring for his ailing mother. By that time, I'm caring for my elderly grandmother. So we'd commiserate around being caregivers and that kind of thing. And I just didn't recognize him as anything other than a good friend. In fact, I tried to set him up with my best friend. I was like, girl, he's marriage material. You want to date him? And I remember she said, well, why aren't you dating him? I'm like, oh, he's my brother. I can't date my brother. I just didn't see him that way. But one day, he confessed his love for me. I didn't feel the same way. I said, thank you, which is not what you want to hear when you tell somebody you love them. It kind of broke the friendship. We weren't in touch for a period of time, skipping over so many details, but finally saw him again about a year and a half later at his mother's funeral. And during that year and a half, God did really an amazing work of just deliverance and maturation in my own heart. I was dealing with, daddy issues and abandonment issues and fear of commitment issues because of my own upbringing. And it was during that time as I began to let the Lord just kind of scrape all of that away from my heart and in some ways my eyes. As I became free of some of those things, I all of a sudden saw him differently and realized that everything that I had been praying and frankly crying and begging God for in a husband had been right there in front of me the whole time. But by the time I realized that, he was dating somebody else. And he's a fiercely loyal, monogamous kind of guy. And so I just thought, well, I missed this opportunity. God, send another one. There's a book out there that says, men are like buses. If you miss one, another one's coming. So I was like, send another one, God. And as it turned out, he eventually broke up with the person that he was with, and he reached out again. And so 15 years after I met him, we began to date. And by that time, I even told him when we started dating, I was like, listen, I don't really need to date you. I've known you 15 years. I know who you are. And by this time I'm past 40. I'm 40, 41. So, biological clock is ticking. My eggs are getting dusty. Like, come on, don't have time to waste. And he was like, hold on. We know each other as friends. We don't know each other in a romantic relationship, in a dating relationship. He goes, let's not skip a step. And so we dated. And I thought we'd date 3 or 4 months. I was like, oh, how cute. And then he would finally propose. Well, that guy proposed almost a year later. I was so annoyed with him by the time he finally proposed because it took so long. But he finally did about 9 months, 10 months later, and then we got married six months after that. And he is the guy of my dreams. He's not a perfect person, but he's perfect for me, and I think I'm perfect for him. And it took me, sadly, 15 years to realize it. But I jokingly say I skipped my first marriage and went straight to the one that was going to last. So I'm grateful for it.
Wonderful. And in 2010, you had your daughter. She came into the world, you said, making lots of noise, and she hasn't stopped since.
She really hasn't. She really hasn't. She's 14 now. And she came out talking, and she talks constantly. She's got a lot to say. She knows her own mind. She got a lot of opinions. She's convinced they're all right. I don't know where she gets that from, but she's a true miracle. I talk about in the book the journey to we just have one child. I jokingly say it was my last good egg. I got pregnant with her at 43 because I got married at 42 and gave birth to her at 44. And so I just believe that she is sent by God. She was meant to be here. I did get pregnant 2 other times, and those ended in miscarries, unfortunately. So I believe that she's here on purpose, and that she's not only a blessing to us, but just a miracle that I was able to naturally conceive and give birth to her. And she's phenomenal, intelligent, beautiful girl.
Wonderful. That's so great to hear. I love at the end of the book how you define success from a biblical perspective. It's not simply the accumulation of things or the achievement of power and status, nor is it defined by our education, careers, jobs, homes, or stock portfolios. Divine success is being who and what God has created you to be.
That's exactly right. I believe that our biggest challenge in life is to discover our God-given purpose. And once we do, our greatest success is to fulfill that purpose through us to our generation. So that when we leave this earth, we will have done everything we were created to do. And yes, it's fun to have accolades and possessions and portfolios and all of that. I love it all. I want it all. But none of those are markers for true success. We were placed here for a reason. And I believe if there's still air in your lungs and your heart is still beating, that you still have a purpose. And it doesn't matter what's happened in the past, what you've done in the past. What matters is what you do from this day forward. And I want to compel anyone that reads my book or listens to this podcast, find your purpose, find out why God put you on this earth and why you are still here, because that's the gold. And when we fulfill that purpose, we will find, I believe, fulfillment and joy and peace and satisfaction beyond our imagination, because we'll be doing what we were created to do.
What a powerful statement and a great way to end this episode. Thank you, Dr. Debbye Turner Bell, for such an amazing interview, and remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
Absolutely. Thank you for opening up the opportunity for doing that. You can find me at my website, and it's just simply www.debbieturnerbell.com. The trick is you got to spell Debbie the way I spell it. And so it's Debbye, Turner, Turner, Bell, Bell, debbieturnerbell.com. You can get information on how to get an autographed copy of my book, Courageous Faith. And then you can find me on all social media. I'm Debbye Turner Bell on Instagram. I'm Debbie TB on Facebook, and Dr. Debbie on Twitter.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.